Ustaz Saria Khalifa is an independent, honor-based violence specialist in development, Project Choice, Oldham Council. Saria Khalifa has been campaigning and working on issues of gender-based violence with a focus on Black and minority ethnic communities for the past 10 years. Currently, Saria provides direct, emotional and practical support for those affected by and at risk of honor-based violence and forced marriage in the Greater Manchester region. Saria joined Project Choice in November 2017. Prior to that, Saria's focus has been on female genital mutilation. She worked at Nestac and helped to set up first Greater Manchester wide support service for girls and young women affected by FGM. Prior to that, Saria was the policy officer on FGM at ROSA, the UK Fund for Women and Girls, with FGM organizations across the UK, and has developed a best practice guide for FGM community engagement. Saria's work on gender-based violence has predominantly been with young people, where she has coordinated both national and European youth projects to train and develop young people to become active campaigners and youth advocates on the issue of FGM. In addition, she has also developed several resources on FGM, including a secondary school lesson which has been PHSE accredited. Sari will take us to the Think Equally component of our presentation.
So I'll look at some statistics, because I am very statistics focused. I think if we don't know what the problem is, we can't solve it. So I'll look at representation in the UK and Sudan. I'll look a little bit about employment and education in Sudan and in the UK. And then I'll focus kind of around violence against women and girls. So I'm going to focus and drill down on violence against women and girls, because that's primarily what my background's in and what I'm passionate about. So kind of to start off the presentation, I did want to get people talking and thinking, so it's not just sort of me talking at you. So I've got a couple of questions. What I'm going to ask you to do is maybe speak to somebody close to you, speak in a three, about some of the questions that are on the board. So it's thinking about gender roles specifically for us as Sudanese people, specifically for us as Sudanese people living in the UK. So what are some of the expectations? What are some of the behaviors? What are some of the things that we say that a good woman or a good girl should be? How should she behave? How should she act? What should she think? What should she aspire to? Are those expectations the same in the UK? Do we have different expectations in Sudan? And then the last one is, are those expectations the same for boys and men? If they are the same, why are they the same? If they're not the same, why are they not the same? So I'll give you a little bit of time to think about that, maybe have a chat, and then if everyone would like to participate, it'd be great to hear what people's thoughts are. So you can chat away, think through what are some of the expectations for girls and women. What do we get told? I did want to also kind of make a slight disclaimer alongside moving around too much when I talk. Most of my background's working with young people, so I sometimes speak to audiences like they're 14, 15. So I apologize if I do that.
I would thank you.
Yeah.
For bringing it to keep it up.
Fantastic. Right, so what are some of the expectations we have for girls and women? You can kind of shout out at me, go for it.
Speaking for our generation as well as younger generations, we still expect girls to have the double burden, to do what girls do and what boys do as well. So we don't sort of prevent them from doing things, but boys seem to be very privileged. Yes.
Because I think as we kind of move forward with the feminist movement, and you'll probably guess I'm a bit of a rah-rah feminist, I think women and girls have expanded what they are allowed to do, but they've not kind of let go of some of the older expectations. So we do get this double burden of potentially things you need to do at home, but then things you also need to do out in the workplace or out in the public. Fantastic. Anybody else? What are some of our expectations for girls and women?
I was telling Dictora Saria is my daughter, by the way. And from very, very early age, she told me, Daddy, don't ever tell me don't do this because you're a girl, and allow my brothers to do it. So I learned from a very early age. وبقولوا المرأة ربوها أهله بربوها أولاده.
Any other expectations?
Sorry. Actually, could I just share something happened just yesterday with my son? His colleague, he's got married with English girl here, and we've been all together at wedding. And Muhammad, he just talked with her and tell her that is Omar by his name, doing cook at home, and Omar straight away he tell him it's not my role, and my son he feel like shock because we are not be like that. And when we came back, I got discussed with my son about that one, and I'm telling Muhammad, when you're doing a family, it's not role of man or woman, but the family they been how the family they been equality and respect, because the equality it takes you to the respect and share of role, and that is not related to the family to be the control. So if you have this idea, then you will know how the role it will be. I tell him it's not being like written, the role of man, role for woman, but share, respect. This is the way we have to get our children to be, because I have to prepare him for the other woman.
It's the responsibility for women and girls, which then ironically the best chefs in the world, Gordon Ramsay, are men. So somehow it's a woman's job, it's innately in us to do it, but when you get paid for it and you get a lot of reputation for it, it becomes a man's thing. Brilliant.
I think there's a massive expectation on women to aspire to marriage, and I think that same expectation is placed on men.
I agree. Fantastic. Marriage is another really big one. Big pressure on both, but definitely a lot more pressure on girls and women. The idea that somehow you've not achieved or you've not fulfilled what you're supposed to if you're not married. I know for myself, every time I go back to Sudan, I then come back and be like, you must find a husband. Fantastic. Anything else?
Yeah, I think if you compare both, I mean, living in Sudan and living here, I mean, most of us, we've lived most of our life in Sudan and then we migrated here. And when you try to sort of think about what you grew up with, though I would say mostly we grew up in even in Sudan in a quite liberal kind of, with the dad pushing for education, and all the rest of it. And I'm the eldest, so I would like doing everything, doing boys things and girls things as well. I mean, I remember when I started driving at the age of 14. I jumped into the car. Anyway, so putting this into perspective here, when we come back here, then, you're starting to, I've got a boy and a girl now, they are in their teens. It is quite sort of difficult to put it in perspective, as there are cultural things that no matter what you try to move out of, then you might find your partner, on the other hand, might be too attached. So if you are a bit liberal from the cultural side of things, then your other half might be too attached to these things, whether they make sense or they don't. But there will always be the sort of conflict there, and within the family, within the your youngsters as well, they will struggle with these little things, culturally, and what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. You take them back home, then again.
Like, give me an example.
Shouldn't be doing that. Shouldn't be doing
What are the
this.
things we shouldn't be doing? Like specifics. What are they?
Yeah, I mean, an example like, girls shouldn't be, going out on their own. You shouldn't be wearing certain things when you are in Sudan. You should behave and dress in a certain kind of code and things. Sitting with boys, say for example, even if it's normal, like here, in schools, they sit together next to each other, isn't it? You go back home, then there are still these divisions that are not quite, they don't quite grasp it. So you tend to say no. That now my daughter tells me, I know when I go to Sudan, I should behave in such and such.
Things in Sudan. Brilliant. Yeah?
So
It's hard to let go of some of our cultural underpinnings, and I think it's always sometimes about being critical, because there are aspects of culture, about faith, that are very useful for us, but it's allowing like that critical thinking of how much does it serve, what's the purpose behind it. I think, was there a hand up on this side? So we do 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we'll finish off that bit.
Just to expand on the culture side, I think the most burden that we put on our daughters from the beginning is, for example, the segregation of duties in the family, and not just the domestic, raising the children. I think this is the most fundamental issue, and we give the mother most of the burden, washing, cleaning, taking care of the children, and men usually they don't go into that side. They just talk to the children, maybe they give them some moral values and things like highlights, but they don't do the tough job. So we are unfair and we expect women to be educated. We also expect them to work, and they also share financial responsibilities at home. But I think it's too much and it's unfair. So we should start changing that, because as mothers we are doing that without even noticing ourselves. We tell our daughters, because do it for him, you're his sister, you're the girl, please, it's okay. So I think we need to change in order to be fair on our girls.
I agree, and I think sometimes, like we see it in language a lot, somehow when men or fathers are taking care of their children, it's seen as babysitting, even though they're their own children, and you're like, this is not a part-time job. That's your role as father. I agree, yeah, fantastic. And I know one of the big feminist issues they're campaigning on in the UK is free childcare, because I think that is a massive block and hindrance for women to enter into the workforce, and this idea that you're working 24 hours, whether that's at home or out in the workplace.
I just want to share also again a story. I have 2 sons and a daughter. They study in Sudan. So the reason why I send them to Sudan, to learn the culture, to know the people there, and so on. So when they come back here for holiday, they come back with all the cultures from there. So the boys, they come in, when I go to work and I come back, I find my daughter, she's upset. What's wrong with you? She says, well, they sit down and they tell me what to do. And that's not what we've blended here. And I said, how? And when I talk to them, they say, well, she's a girl. When we went to Sudan, everybody there was sitting down there, and the girl they were serving. So she has to do it. So this is the culture now we're facing. I mean, although it's nice to have culture and to have people going back and learn about families, but then again there is a bad side of it.
Exactly, it seeps in, because I think the demarcations, the clarity between male and female is a lot stronger in Sudan than it is here. And I can imagine for young people as they're moving from here and coming back, that's a lot of confusion for them. They're unsure of where their roles are, where they fit in. Fantastic. And then back, you had a point?
Actually, as well, I want to add, sorry, I didn't hear anyone very well, so I may repeat, and I'm sorry for that if I'm repeating. But part of it is the background of the family, the educational level, whether they're actually integrated in this society or not. So depending on that, actually, what you expect from both sexes is going to be actually, because you can actually up your game while you are in this society. But some people choose to stay in their closed communities, and actually till now you go and they segregate even in their household men from women. So men kind of go together and enjoy, and I always raise a point, is that في الندوات بتاعتنا so many في الندوات, and I say, where are your spouses, where are the girls? And a lot of political gatherings, you will find men, and you hardly see any women. So I'm very pleased that I could see lots of women today, and I think we should rethink about what we do.
There was a speaker earlier talking about empowerment, and how do we begin to gain empowerment if we're not even there for the conversations? If we're expected to be somewhere else picking up the tea tray and setting it down and making sure everyone's watered and fed, you're not able to take part in those discussions and gain that knowledge, gain those opinions. Fantastic. Thank you so much for contributing. I'm mindful of the time, so I'm going to kind of zip through a little bit of my presentation is very like statistics heavy and very text heavy, but a lot of the things we talked about are on the slide. So basically thinking about the context of equality for women, it's really important to remember that women who are exposed to greater amounts of poverty, or with the statistics you showed that actually for the PPP for women in Sudan, it's significantly less for women, it was like 1.7, and for men it's 4. So if you then don't have that financial freedom, that luxury, your options and your choices are significantly more limited. You're in a space where you're already on the back foot. And then we talked about the fact that women have this greater responsibility of taking care of not only of the children, but also taking care of the elders within the community. I know a lot of times, sometimes, I do a lot of work now within the Pakistani community, and there's lots of this idea of you get married and then you have to live with the mother-in-law because that wife's job is to then take care of the older parents within that household. And then there's this massive reliance on men for the income. So if there's one person in the house who's the sole financial provider, unfortunately, with money comes power, and then people are put in positions where they don't have as many choices, as many options. And then the endemic nature of men's violence. So when we look at violence against women and girls, that is a global problem that happens everywhere, including the UK. I'll show up some of the statistics later on, but at the moment in the UK, 1 in 4 women experience domestic violence. So that's massive, massive amounts of people. It is a public health crisis, and we don't really talk about it in those terms. As well as then when we start looking at specifically black and minority ethnic culture, specifically Sudanese culture, this idea of honor or sharaf or family reputation, sum'ata, the idea that dibit koisa min ahal kois, that puts a whole added pressure to women and girls in terms of their behavior and the consequences for them if they step out of line around that behavior. And unfortunately, there are then some communities, some families, some cultures where the violence level might exacerbate as a way to manage or maintain that idea of reputation, or what will people say. You know, similarly, in terms of even sharing our personal stories, we're geared to be in such a shame culture of like, everyone has to believe that my life is perfectly together and I'm absolutely doing everything right, so we feel too ashamed or too embarrassed or too vulnerable to be able to share our stories. So I think you did such a fantastic job being so brave to share your personal experiences. And we talked about the double burden. It's fantastic. I think it was yourself who'd mentioned it, this idea that for many women, they're combining paid work out of the home with lots of unpaid work in the home. So laundry that gets done, cooking that gets done, cleaning that gets done. And within kind of the feminist world, a lot of that's called the pink tax. This idea that actually there's a whole amount of labor and effectivity that we're putting into the economy as women that somehow doesn't get accounted for absolutely anywhere. Because technically, if we started paying other people to do all of the things we're doing, that's a lot of money that's going someplace else that women are just naturally absorbing, and we're not really questioning or thinking about it. So even in the UK, 70% of all housework is still done by women. Even if they work full-time at 30 hours a week, they're still going to go back home and expect to do it. And nearly 2/3 of all housework in the UK is done by women. So it's not just individual women's personal experiences saying my husband does not help me out. The statistics back it up, and I'm mindful some of the men in the room are not particularly pleased with the information, but the stats sort of speak for themselves. So in terms of then thinking about how women and men are unequal, in terms of health, and I think it's really, you talked a little bit about education and the level of education in Sudan. So at the moment, the average is about 7, I think you were saying, and then for adults, it was 3 years. What we find is that when people do have access to formal education, they are more likely to make safer and healthier choices for their families. They're more likely to participate in immunization. They're more likely to seek medical care when they're pregnant. They're more likely to look at the nutritional needs of the family. So when we're talking about education, it's not just that individual person being able to go out and get work and get financial freedom. It's also thinking, how do we grow a whole population, a whole community, a whole society to make sure that they're safer. Very depressingly, violence is still the leading cause of ill health for women and girls. More than like cancer, more than malaria, more than diabetes, more than anything else put together, violence is the largest cause of ill health for women. And then there's just some disparities around BME black communities in the UK and black women in the UK, because we don't specifically go to like breast screenings, things like that, which would mean we'd prevent things like cancer.
Can you give us a little bit of insight on this violence piece? Is it psychological violence or is it...
So a whole range of it. So within the UK, kind of the definition they'd use for violence would be, so you've got your physical violence, being hit, punched, scratched, strangled. You've got sexual violence, so rape, sexual assault, harassment. You then have financial violence, so that could be specifically about withholding money, people being told like you need to provide receipts for everything. And then there's emotional violence as well. So that can be, so that could be about like people being insulted, people being made to like be gaslighted, where they're believed to feel like they're crazy, people's self-esteem being slowly eroded, which might then mean that they partake in like more risky behavior as a way to like cope with how they're feeling. And I think unfortunately sometimes we just look at violence as like physical, where we go, oh, it's fine because he didn't hit me or he didn't slap me, so actually it's not an issue. And we're forgetting like there's could be years and years and years of somebody not controlling another person's behavior or stalking them, harassing them. So that's, yeah, the context of violence within that. Right, sorry, I'm talking super quick because I'm mindful of the time. So in terms of education, you've touched a little bit on it. I know we looked at the stats in Sudan, but even in the UK, computer science, only 17.2% of the admissions are female. Engineering and technology, 16.7%. So definitely women are underrepresented in STEM, and it's fantastic. I know in the UK they are trying to bring women into STEM. And then in Sudan, similarly, we kind of looked at some of the literacy rates. So it is disproportionate with men being able to access more education, which therefore then means they're more likely to access jobs that provide more finances. And although, for example, in the UK, women are overrepresented in education, so I think it's like 60 or 70% of students in education are female. The challenge with that is most of the jobs, most of the professions women get pushed into with our expectation means that they get paid financially a lot less later on. So nurses get paid a lot less, teachers get paid a lot less. But if you grow up as a woman being told, oh, you need to be really caring and you need to be really kind and you need to be really sweet and soft, you're then unlikely to think I can then go and do a job where I can be a lot more aggressive or I can be a lot more direct. And unfortunately, that's where the money is, that's where the value is. So in terms of representation, just a little bit about the UK. So in terms of politics, 29% of women MPs, 32% of local councillors. Interestingly, we're not doing too bad in Sudan. 30.5% of parliamentary members are women, and 11.4% of women hold ministerial level positions. So we're doing well in terms of politics. I always find the media one quite interesting. 65% of all news stories that are ever written in the UK are about men. It's almost like women don't do anything of note or that is interesting at all. And then 75% of people who are spokespeople that get quoted in the media are also men. So again, this idea that we value men's opinions and their expertise more than we would for women and girls. In terms of employment, what we're finding is more women are entering the workforce, but they hit sort of a glass ceiling. They're not able to move into senior management positions. So for example, because I know a lot of Sudanese people are in the health sector, I pulled up the health quote, that despite women making up the largest percentage of NHS professionals, we've got 47% of GPs, but only 32 are consultants. So there seems to be this gap in terms of people being able to move up. And I think part of that is structural, where employers are more likely to employ someone who looks like them, and therefore that disadvantages women, but that also disadvantages people of color. But I think then the second challenge is what you talked about, this double burden. If you're coming back and working a whole nother shift at home, you're unlikely to be having the time or the energy to put in that extra work to move yourself up in the career ladder. The gender pay gap in the UK is still 20%, so women earn a lot less money for doing the exact same job as men. And that's in addition to the fact that women's roles that they tend to go into are less paid than men. And then in Sudan specifically, they had 33% of the women of working age were part of the labor force, whereas 76% of men work. And it was interesting what you brought up, the rural and the urban difference. I think sometimes, unfortunately, with privilege, if you're coming from a family that has a lot of disposable income, there's sort of less of a push for women to go work, because it's like, well, there's no need, it's not safe to be out of the house, someone else can provide for you, what you want to do is just be looked after, and we get very focused on the finances and not focused on like the skills and the empowerment that you get from being out of the home and interacting with different people. I am nearly done. Right, so my favorite bit, things around safety and violence against women and girls. So globally, 150 million girls under the age of 18 have suffered from sexual violence. She's not even looking at the whole other bits of violence, just sexual violence. 150 million women and girls. 44% of girls under the age of 15 in the UK have experienced already some form of violence. That's before they've become even like proper adults. And 68% of women have suffered sexual harassment. Again, that's the UK statistics. 21% have suffered some form of childhood sexual abuse. And what we're seeing in the UK at the moment is like massive exposure of child sexual exploitation rings, where they were like very historic, lots of professionals turning a blind eye to girls who were actively groomed for years and years and years and years. So there's 1.4 million victims of domestic violence. In terms of police call-outs, that is the most amount of police call-outs is specifically around domestic violence, where previously police were dealing with like crime, robberies, things like that. They've now got whole units dedicated just to safeguarding and around violence. 46% of women in the UK who are murdered by someone they know, usually a partner or an ex-partner. So that's about 50% of women who get killed because of intimate partner violence or DV. And even though we have all of those statistics, only 27% of domestic violence gets reported to the police. So I do a lot of casework with people who are experiencing violence. I'd say I've had, in the 100 plus clients that I've had, 2 of them have gone to report to the police. Every single other person absolutely refuses. And I know they're definitely telling me a lot less about what's happening at home than the reality.
And is that for fear, or is that for what's the reason behind it?
I think there's elements of it of fear. There's elements of we still get told that it is a private issue, that you need to deal with it at home. You should tell your parents. There's the stigma and protection. Yes, sometimes people think it's going to escalate. If I go out and tell somebody and they find out, they get put in jail. Unfortunately, also in terms of police convictions, they're very, very low. I worked with a woman. She got assaulted by a neighbor. He broke into her house, assaulted her, and then that was in July. The trial came in January. He pled guilty, so he definitely did it. He tied her up with zip cords and everything. Even though he pled guilty, they said, oh, he'd served the time and he was out. He walked out that exact same day at court. So unfortunately, criminal justice system also really does not help women and girls. Worryingly for me is about people's attitudes. So again, in the UK, which is seen as liberal, 36% of people believe that a woman should be partially held responsible if she gets attacked and she's drunk at the time. 26% of people believe that if a woman gets attacked and she's wearing revealing clothing or inappropriate clothing, then it's her fault. So again, if we think back to social expectations, you talked about it earlier of تلبسي كيف, where you're supposed to go. If people are still holding those belief systems, that's why we then perpetuate and say to girls, make sure you don't go out too late. Make sure you wear these specific things. Because we know this in our minds, we know it happens, but we don't want to tell them that's what we're worried about. Instead, we kind of control and manage girls and women without addressing the wider problem. So, safety in Sudan. We have no statistics. No statistics on domestic violence. No statistics on rape. No statistics around sexual violence. I tried the last time I was in Sudan, I did a talk on FGM, and I tried to be like, so can I talk about sexual harassment? Because that's sort of where our primary focus is. And they were like, no, we get shut down by the government if anyone brings up anything to do with sexual violence or rape or sexual harassment in Sudan. So again, we think back on statistics, why they're important. If we don't see a problem, we can't fix it. If no one's collecting data in Sudan, how do we know if domestic violence is happening? And what I hear from a lot of Sudanese communities, people tell me, yeah, في السودان احنا ما بندق. we don't ever do that. And I'm like, well, anecdotal evidence, the women I've worked with show me that is not the case. But if we keep believing we don't do that as Sudanese people, we don't tackle the problem. Interestingly, child marriage, massive issue in Sudan. So 32.9% of the children who get married in Sudan are under the age of 18. And they are children, so they should not be getting married. And legislation, you're allowed to get married in Sudan if you're 10 years old or 11, as long as your parents consent or the court says there's a justifiable reason for you to get married. Massive concern, 10 years old person, I think children. And then they did some stuff around attitudes, because I think prevalence is important. We need to know how many people, but more importantly, we need to know why people are doing the things they're doing or what they're thinking. 34% of Sudanese women were able to justify physical violence, domestic violence in the home. Bizarrely, they called it wife beating, but it is domestic violence. 34% of people think it's okay if that happens to them. And then I don't know if people have heard of Noura Hussein. Yeah, the case that happened, I think, earlier this year. So she got forced into a marriage at the age of 16. Her parents kindly allowed her to finish education. So she never physically consummated the marriage until she was 19. She was married to a man who was 35 years old, so significantly older than her. At 16, she's a child. We're really like, you're not, in 16 in the UK, you can't get a tattoo. If you can't make that big of a decision, how do you decide to marry someone at the age of 16? She refused to consummate the marriage, and they waited a couple of days, and then her husband and other family members physically held her down, and she was raped to be able to consummate the marriage. He then the next night tried to rape her again, used a knife to threaten her. She took that knife off of him and stabbed him. He died. Interestingly, she then ended up in prison for murdering her husband. Bizarrely, in Sudan, we don't have legislation against marital rape. Also, when you discuss marital rape with Sudanese people, they don't believe it exists. So I think legislation's another couple of steps away. She was only saved from the death sentence because people publicly campaigned to stop that. And a lot of times what I work on, honor-based violence, in the UK it gets seen as a Pakistani problem, a Bangladeshi problem, an Indian problem. But for me, a case like that, that's honor-based violence, right? That's forced marriage. If we then don't, within our own communities, start talking about what does honor mean for us, what does the sum'a mean, what does reputation mean, what are some of the expectations, it means lots of girls and women go completely unsupported. They're not able to say anything to anyone, they're not able to get help because they think, oh, somehow it's my fault, or actually this isn't really happening because Sudanese people don't do that. So that's sort of the end of my presentation. Yeah, fine, thank you.
And one of the issues or the thing that stop women from reporting is the vulnerability of the women. Because most of the women came here joining their husband, they stayed at home doing nothing. Yeah. At some point, just the men take over and just let them isolate them from their neighbors, their network, from wherever they want to know, they isolate them. And the other thing, the social service as well, because they're not aware of the system, they're not aware of the law, what they can do, what they can say, and they get afraid about the social sector as well. They can take their children from them, they can put them in the registers, and this is why they just keep silence and suffering, and they get into depression.
Yeah. And people who come in on spousal visas, they get told, oh, if you leave me or you report, I'm going to send you back, I'm going to take your immigration papers off of you. Some people don't even see their passports. Lots of issues then if people are in the home, don't speak the language, how do you call the police? So I agree, lots of barriers. My slight plug to Ahfad support group, I think it'd be really fascinating to do a whole session on domestic violence, because I think it's not something we talk about enough in the Sudanese community, and it's not something we understand as much in the Sudanese community. And it's massive. It's like anyone who's pretending it doesn't happen is just, yeah.
Just to add on a comment regarding domestic violence, people may not remember this, but about, I think 7-8 years ago, there was a domestic violence case of Sudanese family. And I think, again, about the issue, we think it's not our problem. So it was a Sudanese problem at the time. The husband beat his wife and he ended up in jail, she ended up in hospital. The problem came to light when social services were trying to find foster parents for the children. And of course, the Sudanese community all wanted to shy away completely from that. At the time, we did try and raise the issue, and I remember Sudanese, National Sudanese Women Alliance tried to hold talks and to bridge the gap with social services to look into how can we as a community support each other. But I think, unfortunately, I think it all died a silent death. So I'm glad that you're raising this again, and I think it is an important topic that we have to keep on our minds.
Too much focus on like, let's fix it in the family. So I know at least 4 young Sudanese women grew up in the UK who've experienced physical violence in their relationships. Alhamdulillah, they're divorced, but the family are just like, don't say anything to anybody, don't report it, nothing. They've just been like, just get out of the marriage and we'll sweep it under the table. Which, like, alhamdulillah, at least she's safe and she's well, and it takes a lot for people to come forward. But I think if we keep pretending it does not happen, like that, it took one of the girls, I know it took her a good year before she was able to get out.
I just want to add to that the point where people don't talk about things and not reporting. For example, an issue like sexual harassment in the workplace, for example.
Yeah.
I know in multinational companies in Sudan, women and young ladies, they've experienced workplace or sexual harassment in the workplace, but they don't report it. And even if a young woman or a lady comes up to report it, the system itself in the organization will try to... Yes,
I agree.
So this is something I really can't conceptualize, and it's amazing when you have a policy of sexual harassment published, but
people ignore it.
You don't talk about it. So it's kind of...
Completely agree. A couple of years back, did a talk on sexual harassment in Sudan. I didn't live in Sudan for very long, 3 years, but the level of sexual harassment was through, like, people would get groped on public transport, and then if you go, يا ولد بتعمل في شنو, they're like, انت مالك تتكلمي, يعني انت داير الحاجة دي. Like, we had one of our lecturers at the university who was known for sexual harassment. Like, you were told as a girl, don't go into his office because he sexually harasses girls. And he was like a top professor running the department, and like no one was like, no, you can't report them. I was really happy to find out a couple of years after my batch graduated that one of the girls went and reported him, and he did get fired from that job, which is positive. But yeah, it just happens.
I have an example in my kids' school where one of the teachers sexually harassed one of the girls in my daughter's class. So he got fired. They took it up with the ministry, and he got reallocated to another school.
This is, I think, one of the biggest reasons when we talk about criminal justice system and people not spending time in jail is because people know they can get away with it. There was a study they did in America with some young men around sexual assault and rape, and it was like something like 49% of men said that they would sexually harass somebody if they knew they could get away with it. And I think that's the challenge. There is an impunity. You know, oh, I can get another job. No one's ever going to say anything. I'm not going to get in trouble. I'm not going to see any jail time. Why not? Sorry.
So just a positive note, really. I think we're all very proud to see how women are leading al-muzaharat. This is, it's been a pleasure to see. وبعدين standing shoulder to shoulder with the men. I think that is something I think we all take a lot of pride in as a Sudanese compared to all other sort of Arab nations, Arab African nations. So there's good some movement.
Absolutely, and I think you just standing here, I really admire your courage, to stand up and talk about such a sensitive topic. I think that's really great. And I think maybe what I be interested in seeing, and it could be a dream, of course, to get all the statistics in place, but how do we compare with the British society and how that movement have happened? Because I know there's a big change that we have to do in our culture. We're working towards that with the new generations, of course, somebody like you, for example. But what is the learnings that we can pick up? That could be really beneficial, because we all have children that we want to educate. So I'd love to hear from you in the future in some session, what are the learnings that we can take up from there. So thank you very much for this.
They've got a gender group there, and they're working on other issues that are more palatable to the government, but hopefully that's where we're moving in the direction, because we've sort of done FGM, we've done child marriage. I think definitely domestic violence, sexual violence, that's something that needs to be tackled and spoken about, and that research done.
Thank you I came late, but thank you for giving me the chance. But is the Sudanese man aware of harassment because he can see the word or the terms like the terminology like "Ya bint ya hilwa." Is that harassment or just like for his culture is coming from? He can call it kalam zarif.
It's uninvited, it's harassment.
But I'm not aware enough because don't adjust him with the rules here now. He's coming from different culture.
I completely agree. I was very surprised when we did the sexual harassment talk. A couple of different men then came up to me and they're like, but how do we know when we've harassed someone? And exactly like you said, you're walking past and go, ya hilwa, how's that harassment? And I think definitely what's needed is more work with men, young men, around safe, healthy ways of communicating with women and girls, around boundaries, about thinking about their privilege, about taking up space. But I think that has to come from a man speaking to a man, like I can say as often as but you know, like the power dynamics are there. So there's, I think, a responsibility maybe to put to the men in this room, particularly the older men in this room, of is there some work that needs to be done within young male Sudanese in the UK around understanding it? Because I agree, people are just like, oh, it's not an issue. I'm being nice, but zaraf. هي بس براها فهمتها غلط.
We'd like to thank Saria for her very interesting talk and very daring one. هقدم أخونا نجيب خليفة for closing remark.
Okay, sorry, Ustaz Ahmed Badri was supposed to do the closing remark, but he apologized and he just stepped out. So he left that job for me. Lakin just simply I wanted to say, to remind ourselves again, this is an activity organized by the أحفاد support group, مجموعة دعم الأحفاد. مجموعة يعني very dynamic ومهمة جدا جدا. بدت حقيقة الفكرة من بعض السيدات السيدات اللي تخرجوا من الأحفاد أول بناتهم رجعوهم السودان يقروا في الأحفاد sort of they wanted to pay back. فيعني collectively we organize ourselves ودي فعالية مهمة جدا جدا. أهميتها جاءت من أختنا الدكتورة رانيا. الدكتورة رانيا كانت عميدة كلية الفاميلي ساينس تغيرت هيلث ساينس نحن اولد فاشون ستيل بنقول فاميلي ساينس. فهي أحفادية رغم انها تخرجت من جامعة الخرطوم، لكن اللي بيشتغل في الأحفاد دي فترة صغيرة جدا جدا بيبقى خلاص يعني indoctrinated. she's يعني a big addition to us. She came joined us in November, last November. It was 2 years since we started activity with the group. فدي واحدة من الفعاليات، وفي مقترح إنها كل شهر تتعامل حاجة اتليست يكون فورم الناس يتلاقوا فيه، وهوبفولي يعني نتطرق لمواضيع مهمة وحيوية زي موضوع الليلة. وطبعا شكر كبير جدا جدا للمتحدثات الثلاثة. I think it was interesting. وحضور مشرف ما شاء الله، ونشكركم خالص. أنا عارف في ناس كتار بيسألوا يقولوا كيف نحن ممكن نبقى أعضاء. العضوية مفتوحة لأي زول، وتهاني هي رئيسة اللجنة التنفيذية للمجموعة for you to know. وكالعادة جابت معاه الفورمات، واللي انترستد يسجل ويدفع طوال الاشتراك. الاشتراك ما كثير 20 جنيه في السنة، 10 جنيه رسوم الاشتراك وتسجيل. في عضوية ثانية بريميوم عضوية اسمهم المؤسسين. دي العضوية بتاعتها 100 جنيه في السنة، فالخيار لكم. و في حاجة ثانية؟ الأعضاء المؤسسين هم اللي أسسوا المجموعة، واللجنة التنفيذية تنتخب ديمقراطيا من الأعضاء المؤسسين. فاللي عنده عايز يشتغل ويكون عضو في اللجنة التنفيذية بحق له ذلك انه يدفع الرسوم. طيب يا جماعه ثانك يو فيري ماتش ونشوفكم الشهر الجاي ان شاء الله.
شكرا جزيلا.